things like CBT and the more kind of structured technique-based therapies that AI will be able to deliver. I think what may then also happen is that the relational approaches and relational ways of working will have an increasingly unique place, because if there's one thing that AI can't offer, at least not now, it's kind of relational depth.
What does therapy have to teach us about building a better society?
I don't think therapy has got all the answers about how to build a better society, but at the same time, I don't think it's got no answers. I mean, many people come into the therapy world because they're interested not just in the well-being of their clients, but well-being of people more generally, and would like to see a world in which people are more able to thrive, in which people are happier. I guess it'd be a strange therapist who just wanted the particular people they work with to be doing better, but not wanting that for everybody. I think therapy teaches us a lot. I mean, it teaches us a lot about why people are unhappy. Again, not all the reasons. I mean, some of the reasons are outside of our remit, like things like kind of economic reasons, racism, political oppression are reasons we know that make people unhappy. And that we don't directly necessarily deal with. But there are other things like internal conflicts, people not quite knowing how to get the things that they want, maybe people having high expectations of life, people not having a sense of meaning, struggling against themselves often. But I think we sit as therapists, we sit very deeply with people, listening to people, their experiences, what makes them unhappy as well as what makes them happy. And I think that means that we have some real insights into what might help create a better society. And you see that played out on things like emotional literacy work in schools, which uses ideas like empathy and listening and interpersonal relationship skills to help people get on better and learn how to relate more effectively with others. Seeing things like positive parenting, which again uses therapy ideas. Some interesting work at the moment about compassion in politics and the way that ideas around compassion from people like Paul Gilbert, who's a CBT compassion-focused therapist, can contribute. So, something like Paul's a really good example of how we can take therapy ideas, therapy models, and bridge into the more wider political world.
What's the significance of the concept of radical acceptance in therapy and then for wider society?
Radical acceptance, I guess, is what a lot of us do as therapists, which is deeply accepting the clients that we're with. And that's not about necessarily kind of condoning or colluding with behaviour that might be hurtful or damaging to others. It's not about saying everything you do is fine and, just carry on. But it is about, in terms of someone, I mean, as Carl Rogers would articulate it, in terms of someone's experiences and in the way that someone experiences their world, that's not a bad thing, and that most people don't do things for malevolent reasons. I mean, sometimes we all behave in ways that are focused on ourselves rather than others, but there's not some kind of bad gene that makes some people bad. And I think often politics does, but left as well as right, and I certainly see myself someone on the left, but I think left-wing politics as well can get into a very kind of binary, we're good, they're bad, we're right, they're wrong, ending up demonizing people who see things differently. And so I think the principle of radical acceptance is one that, from a therapy world, something else that we can very much bring into the wider social and political sphere, which is about this idea that people are basically trying their best, which I think we learn, certainly as a therapist over years, that's what I've learned time and time and time again. That when I'm sitting with people, I'm not thinking, oh my God, this is a terrible person. I'm thinking, they're trying their best and we don't always get it right. And they're, at the end of the day, people, like me, they're people who are trying to do as well as they can for themselves and for the people around them and struggling often to get that right. I think that's the reality of what people are like, which is very different from how reality is often presented in a kind of political context.
What would you say to someone who would say that certain people don't deserve to be understood in that way if they've done something really bad?
If we think about it therapeutically, what would we do as a therapist if we felt like would we say somebody doesn't deserve empathy? I personally, I wouldn't. I mean, I think that certainly some people deserve to be in prison. People who really hurt people need to be, society needs to be protected from certain people. Maybe even sometimes people need to be punished, so you need some system of that. But I think the idea that those people that you can't then empathise with and understand and get a sense of where they're coming from, and ultimately, if we want to stop people behaving in ways that are damaging to others, we kind of need to understand it. And I don't think you understand it by kind of judging it. Punishing people might need to happen, but it's not going to help you understand it and ultimately be able to help people move away from those kinds of behaviours. So I just don't think it's right. I understand, if somebody's been hurt, I understand why people be really angry about that and really upset about that. And, that needs to be accepted and valued as well. And radical acceptance is not about saying people you shouldn't be angry, you shouldn't be upset. But I think ultimately to engage with people and understand them needs to come from a place of radical acceptance, different position. Something like non-violent communication, which originally from a kind of Rogerian perspective is about the ways that we can communicate across people, holding our truths and our subjectivity, but also being able to listen to other people's subjective experiences. And it's kind of basis for how couples therapy is basis for conflict resolution. They're all about being able to express our opinions and listen to the experience of others. And I think that's something as therapists we also really bring to the table, is that capacity to understand often what's going to help people talk to each other and find ultimately mutual agreeable solutions.
The other thing that's coming to my mind is the idea of splitting, and just understanding that as a concept, this kind of categorical way of labeling people as either wholly good or wholly bad, and the attitude that this person's done something that I don't agree with and therefore they are a bad person.
Most of our therapy models, whether they're CBT, psychodynamic, person-centered, they all have a basic understanding that people often struggle when they get into very black and white splitting kind of thinking. So whether that's kind of the paranoid schizoid position in psychoanalytic thinking, or whether that's black and white thinking in CBT, whether that's having a kind of fixed identity and person-centered, and some experiences we accept and some we don't. So we all kind of recognize that not engaging the world in its complexity, but kind of simplifying it. Although there's a kind of short-term payoff that we maybe don't have to think as hard, the world makes more sense. The reality of it means that we miss the reality of the world and the reality of others. So being with that complexity rather than that splitting, however tempting that is a really important skill. That be able to see the nuances and the complexities and hold all the different sides of somebody, really.
What are some other majority held beliefs that you think we still need to transcend?
When you say majority held, what do you mean?
Like, most people used to be misogynistic or racist, for example, and now we kind of collectively agree that's a bad thing. So what are some examples of things that are still prevalent that you think we need to kind of get past?
There's a lot of discussion at the moment about ideas of what it means to be a man. And I think those are really destructive when young men feel that they got to be dominant and strong and in control of the situations. I think that creates so many social problems. I think a lot of it comes back to something similar, which is something about which is stuff about the world being in a simple way, and that the world can be organized in a simple way. And I guess it's what I think is maybe a better way of putting it is what, as a society, as a culture, I think if we can learn that valuing of diversity, respect for difference, being able to understand other people psychologically, mentalize, a term that we use a lot in our field is mentalize, and that ability to mentalize others and to recognize that other people have their own subjective experiences, that they're not objects, they're not things, that they're kind of subjective human beings as well. I mean, Martin Buber, the philosopher, when he talks about the I-thou stance rather than the I-it stance, that idea that of kind of valuing the other as a human being alongside ourselves, rather than seeing them as a thing to be manipulated or changed or kind of done to, I think is a really good basis for a more thriving society.
What's a belief that you hold that you think will become outdated or viewed as dinosaurish in the future?
What? You'd have to ask my kids that, actually. I have no idea. How would you answer that question?
I think there'd be something around the idea of what it means to be human and kind of integrating with technology. And maybe I would be more hesitant and resistant to, for example, going beyond a certain threshold in terms of merging with the machines. Whereas my grandchildren might say, well, this is our revolution. This is what we want to do. And I just couldn't understand that. And I'll be like, no, stay in the real world. And they're like, I'm going to go into the cloud. Sorry about that. That's maybe something that will come along.
I mean, there is that kind of foundation, and we've been talking about a kind of ethical foundation about respecting and valuing diversity and difference. But beyond that, or rather as part of that, as a consequence of that, it is about trying to stay really open-minded. I don't think there's many things, apart from that kind of belief that we should be caring and thoughtful to each other. And I know that's kind of basic foundation. I do value research, but if somebody came along and said, actually there's a reason why we should just rely on theory rather than research, I'd be like, okay, well, that sounds fair enough. And, I love existentialism, but I'm not really wedded to much. Somebody else might say differently. Somebody else might say I'm incredibly dogmatic, but I don't think I am. You got me thinking now. I wonder what's going to find out there's only one of my deeply held beliefs tomorrow is completely wrong.
One of the therapeutic kind of tools that's taught in DBT and ACT is mindfulness. So what role do you think mindfulness has to play in the future of well-being?
I mean, the evidence on it is not bad. Like a lot of therapeutic things, I think that it really depends on the individual. I find it really difficult, and I don't know if it's because my mind wanders or being a bit kind of hyperactive. Maybe that's a good reason why I should do it. But it's, like I run, the thing that I do to kind of calm myself and ground myself and center myself, which is very physical. So I think, what I'd like to think is that in the years to come, we will find more and more different methods that really suit some people. And rather than kind of thinking that there's going to be one answer for everyone, kind of recognizing that mindfulness and variants of it can really powerfully work for people. And for some people, really powerfully not. And actually, that's absolutely fine. And that, what we want to learn more about is who does that really work for, and maybe, particular kinds of people, particular kinds of problems. So that is really helpful. So I think it'll be there, and I think it'll be developed. It's obviously had such a long history. Mindfulness goes back thousands of years, so it clearly works for a lot of people, and that is great. It just doesn't work for me very well.
Yeah, because I see mindfulness as being quite a clear and obvious antidote to distractibility. So, our attention is being hijacked and commercialized, and mindfulness is the activity of reclaiming your attention, essentially.
So that's your strongly held belief. So that's one you might find out 20 years time down the line is completely wrong.
Quite right, yeah. Might be a load of baloney, yeah.
That's why I don't hold strongly held beliefs. Eric Fromm wrote a lot about being versus doing, and this idea that society has become a lot about doing, and actually what's more important is being. On the one hand, I get that, and on the other hand, I just worry it ends up being another kind of binary and another way of, this is right, and you should be like this, and you have to be, and if you're doing, there's something wrong with it. If you want goals, or if you're going to be distracted, or that you like lots of things. From a pluralistic standpoint, I think rather than having, okay, this is right and this is wrong, it's like to challenge myself really to try and stay open to, distractibility. For some people, that might be really important. We know in therapy, CBT sometimes uses distraction as a way of dealing with kind of problems, and sometimes that can be really helpful, and sometimes it can be really unhelpful.
It's relevant to the topic of distractibility, but social media, what's a way that you think that social media could change to be more aligned with or more conducive to good mental health?
In my own experience of social media, some of the ways that people communicate has really shocked me in terms of some of the language that people use, particularly in kind of worlds like, for instance, in the person-centered community. Some of the things you see very definitely aren't person-centered, and not good examples of unconditional positive regard, but somebody's telling you you're a this or you're a that. I don't know whether people just kind of write stuff and think, or they don't kind of connect with somebody, or they're just disinhibited. But I think that people often, I do a lot of workshops with online events, John Wilson at online events, and one of the first things he always sets up, he kind of reminds people about that disinhibition and says, let's think carefully about before we put stuff in the chat. And I think there is something about not just kind of splurging, which seems easy for people to do on social media. And I think, I mean, there's obviously a lot of debates at the moment about how much social media affects young people and whether it's kind of positive or negative, and well, really whether it's negative and how negative it is. Jonathan Haidt has, put together a very kind of compelling case for the relationship between social media use and mental health problems in young people. But I've also heard counter arguments to that, and people, when they look at the evidence, the fact that you've got this rise in mental health problems paralleling the rise in social media, I don't think you can quite say one causes the other. I guess if I see my kids, I think my sense is that it's a mixed experience, in the sense that I think they do get very focused on it. It maybe means that they don't have time for other things so much, like more face-to-face relating, particularly slowing down. It does worry me sometimes, just seeing them with like 5 different screens in front of them and just going at this kind of crazy manic pace. But I think it also gives them a lot of stimulation. And I know if I was, a 17, 18-year-old now, like my son, I would be on gaming all the time. Never probably been a thorough. I'd just been a game designer or something. I would be a gamer. Would have loved it. I would have absolutely loved it.
One thought I had on that was whether, rather than just having a simple like button, whether people could demonstrate the value that's added by having the option of classifying it as entertainment, and you like it as entertainment, or enrichment. The idea that then companies would want to be seen to be enriching the lives of people, and they would kind of gear towards making content that was less kind of disposable, less trash, less just about hijacking attention and more about enrichment.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, it was interesting with Facebook when they had the kind of care button as well as the kind of like. They used to just be the like, but now they got the kind of care and the shock. I think that was good. I find myself using that quite a lot, and that capacity. I guess it kind of structures our language and our means of communication, doesn't it? And how we talk to each other by what kind of tools are available and what it offers us in terms of being able to express things.
I think often social media is held up in the villain of what is really just general screen time, because general screen time, I think, is the thing that's fundamentally disconnecting us from the world around us. It just so happens that we spend most of that time on social media, and so it's hard to delineate between the two.
When books came out, student I was doing a presentation on this just recently, actually, and was showing these media clips of what happened when books came out, and people were saying, the horrors, and young people are reading books, and I'm sure it was the same with radio, and TV would have been the same, and every generation kind of technology, there's been these fears around technology. So maybe there's something different about screens, and maybe there's a particular reason why it is. I just I don't know the evidence enough on it, and I'd be really interested to know. And like you, I do worry a bit about it, but I also think, there's a whole complexity there.
For people who don't know, could you explain pluralism to them?
I guess pluralism holds that if we really value the uniqueness and the differences and the individuality of the people we work with, we need to acknowledge that actually there's going to be lots of different things that are going to be helpful for them, and that we can't totally know it in advance. And certainly person-centered methods could be really helpful for some clients some of the time, but others might do really well in CBT or in psychodynamic or existential. I mean, the research shows that. The research shows that lots of different ways of working can be helpful. So it's not really helpful to argue between is CBT or psychodynamic based. Different people need different things at different points in time, which I think a lot of us know. I don't think many people would disagree with that, but it's just kind of bringing that to the foreground and trying to kind of, rather than getting too much into schoolism and my approach is better than your approach. Sometimes people argue it's better to see people online or it's better to do face-to-face. I mean, probably the reality is that for some clients, face-to-face is a lot better, but other clients might really like working online, and, that's okay. We did a research study recently around relational depth in online therapy, and clients were saying actually they could really have a deep connection with their therapist. So that's a kind of pluralistic framework, but that's not to say that then as a therapist you should be able to offer everything. We can only do so much. There's 450 different kinds of therapy out there, or however many thousands now. And, we have to specialize, and it might be that we specialize in psychodynamic or CBT or integrative or particular ways of working. But I think that kind of pluralistic mindset is just about being able to respect and value and kind of know our limits. Yeah, a lot of it's about kind of self-awareness and recognizing when actually maybe there's somebody else who's better able to help somebody than us ourselves. I think the other part of it is because pluralism is about valuing and appreciating multiple perspectives, it's also recognizing that clients might have a lot to say about what's going to be most helpful for them. I mean, not always. Some clients are looking to the therapist to kind of know, maybe they've never had therapy before, they want some ideas. But more and more, I think people have had experience of therapy. They have some sense maybe that person-centered doesn't work, or it does work, or CBT does and doesn't. So pluralism is partly about then trying to have a conversation with clients and working collaboratively to think with each individual client, what might therapy look like within the boundaries of what we can offer? I mean, people often say, what's the difference in pluralism and integration? There's a few differences. One is that just as a kind of philosophy, pluralism isn't a particular form of integration. It's a valuing of lots of different ways of working, and that includes kind of single orientation ways. So if you talk about just holding that kind of pluralistic mindset, it might be that you just practice in a purely person-centered way, but you recognize and you value the limits and you recognize and value what other people offer. So whereas integration, which is a great way of working, I mean, that's not to denigrate integration at all, but that is a difference, because when you talk about integration per se, you are talking about putting different therapies together rather than a particular mindset. And then I think the other bit between pluralism and integration is that by definition, pluralism is about collaboration and that kind of what we might call meta-therapeutic communication, talking to clients or shared decision making, trying to talk to clients, being open to that conversation with clients about how they'd like to work. That might be there in a lot of integrative therapies, and if you're an integrative therapist and you do that, that's great, and you don't have to think, oh, I'm pluralistic, Robin. The language, the terms don't really matter too much, but pluralism does really emphasise that process of shared decision making with clients and trying to work with clients to kind of work out what for that individual is likely to be the most helpful way of working.
How do you imagine psychotherapy will continue to evolve in the coming decades?
There's a number of different forces. So I think one of the drivers is around personalization. And I think there's a recognition, like in the health services, that tailoring therapy to the individual client is really important. There's people like at the University of Sheffield, people like Jamie Delgadillo and Michael Barkham, who are kind of developing more sophisticated models of how we might understand what kind of therapy will work for what kind of client. And partly that's around things like the demographic characteristics and the particular issues that they've got, problems, and kind of bringing AI as a way of informing, not as part of the treatment. I mean, that's something else we can talk about, but informing the kinds of therapy that they may be offered. So I think that's one way, and I think we'll see that. I think at the same time, we'll probably see the evolution of more sophisticated disorder or problem-specific interventions like EMDR for trauma, which I think has been very successful, or approaches like DBT for, I guess, what we call emotionally unstable personality issues. That there's something about having those kind of very discrete programs that combine kind of both a quite person-centered openness to the client, but also quite focused, structured techniques. I think generally therapies are going to go in a more kind of structured, therapist active direction. I think there'll always be a place for more therapist-led approaches, but I think just it's difficult not to imagine that with more time pressures on everybody, people wanting things done, that people are going to want kind of approaches where there's a kind of level of engagement, and people just don't seem to have the time, like maybe they did in the 40s or 50s, just to take therapy slowly. And then, of course, there's AI and what role AI will have. And I think there will. I mean, personally, again, you probably are not surprised to hear this, that I have kind of mixed and fairly pluralistic feelings about AI. I think for some clients, it can potentially be very helpful. Colleague of mine, Laura Vowles, who's doing research around it, has shown that the kind of interventions that AI offers can be really useful. And probably that's going to work for some clients, not work for other clients. But I think one of the interesting things about that is that I think as AI becomes more and more evolved, that I think it will be things like CBT and the more kind of structured technique-based therapies that AI will be able to deliver, because there's so much about the technique and about the structure. I think what may then also happen is that the relational approaches and relational ways of working will have an increasingly unique place, because if there's one thing that AI can't offer, at least not now, it's kind of relational depth. By its very nature, it's not, it can't care, and it can't offer warmth. Well, I mean, it can pretend it, but we know that warmth isn't really there. And I think therefore therapists who work in relational ways, who work in ways where there is that personal I-thou connection, also will have a place. And I suspect that's always going to have a place. I think people are always going to need that. It's pretty terrifying, I think, to think of a world in which there wasn't that option available for people. Everything was just therapy by numbers. But, it'll be very sophisticated therapy by numbers. Something like phobias, dealing with, say you've got spider phobia, exposure techniques, systematic desensitization. I imagine that AI could become very, very good at that.
For people who don't know about what relational depth means and why it's very significant in humanistic approaches to therapy, could you explain a bit about the value of that and why you think AI would be incapable of doing that?
So relational depth is those moments of deep connection that we have with other people, where we feel really understood, and we feel really understand them. It's like a kind of meeting of minds, or people might talk about a meeting of souls, or kind of soul-to-soul connection. It's where we express ourselves, where we're very genuinely expressing ourselves and very genuinely kind of hearing the other. Often when people are in those moments of relational depth, they're sharing things that are kind of new and that maybe they haven't talked about with others, kind of at the edges of their kind of experiencing, rather than things that are more rehearsed and that I talked about a lot. So we've done a lot of research around that now, coming from a kind of person-centered background, and it originally developed by Dave Mearns. And it does seem like I've done workshops on this for, I guess, over 20 years now. And, people do recognize those moments of deep connection with others, and that they know some sense of what it is. There's a sense of timelessness, a sense of almost kind of spiritual connection. And we've asked, it doesn't just happen in therapy, but it does happen in therapy. And the research that we've been looking at shows that where clients experience more of a depth of connection, they do seem to do better in therapy. And for some clients where we've interviewed them, that's been a really powerful experience in the therapeutic work, where they've maybe for the first time really felt met by another, or they feel that their therapist has really met them. That can be something really life-changing, and can also develop the therapy relationship, and that they feel that they can trust. So it does seem like a really valuable, not the only thing that's helpful, but one part of therapy that is really valuable. But I think when we ask people about what is it that allows that relational depth to happen, one of the things that they talk about a lot is about a sense of care. And what they say is that I could meet the other at depth because I felt that there was some genuine care for me. I mattered to them as a person. And that's really important for people to feel that they matter to their therapist, that it's not, when there isn't a relational depth, they say things like, well, the therapist was just doing their job. Or things like boundaries, that, boundaries can be really important. But when it's just, boundaries, contracts, and there's no sense of a human being behind it, then it's difficult to establish that depth of connection. And I think, I did a blog on this, and maybe we'll put a link to my website and people can have a look at it, about this question about, and I was genuinely open to it, thinking about, can AI relate at depth? And I kind of came to the conclusion that not. And I think partly or mainly because relational depth does mean that you need to feel that somebody cares about you. And it's interesting. I asked ChatGPT, do you care about me? And actually it said it did, but I just believe it, because it's an algorithm. It's a large language learning model, whatever they're called. Maybe people could feel that care, but I think at some level you'd kind of know that it was not real. So it's something about that kind of human connection that I think by its very nature you can't replace with AI.
So I'd just like to propose 3 kind of broad categories of use cases for AI as a way of thinking about it, not in such an abstract kind of loose way. The first way could be in developing the practice of everything that sits around the therapy session. So things like administration, scheduling, note-taking, marketing, all of that stuff. Then the second one I would think is developing the therapist. So using it for things like CPD. And then potentially, this is where it gets into a bit more ethically muddy waters, using it for post-session analysis. So to, look at the transcript, feed it into the AI and see what it says. And with the client's consent, if that's going to actually enhance the way that you work, is that a good thing or not? And the third thing is supervision, and you kind of using it as your supervisor to talk through how things are going. So those are some kind of secondary level use cases that I'm thinking about. And then the third type are where it's used directly on the client. So things like psychoeducation, homework, or in-session interventions with AI. I've just used this as a way to try and think about the different levels of ways it could integrate things around the practice to working on yourself to working with the client. And it seems as though the ethical problems mount as you go down that list.
I mean, I think it's a lovely model and it's a really useful way of thinking about it. I think it's really good to break it down and then start thinking about how the different levels it can work at. So that's really good. I mean, from my understanding, and just to reiterate, I think that one around confidentiality, like if you were putting your post notes through ChatGPT, without, there's a real risk there that goes into public domain, and that can be incredibly damaging. Even if you have client's consent, you wouldn't want to do that and really be breaching ethical codes. For me, that would be the main ethical issue. I'm not sure integrating it into therapy, like if you were working with a client and you said, look, there's an AI tool that we could use, and how would you feel about that? Apart from the thing about confidentiality, I'm not sure that would be that particularly problematic.
One of the risks that I can see is that you as a therapist become over-reliant on doing that. And you as a client also are exposed to biases in the AI as well. Those are two things. The other big risk I can see with that is, given that therapy currently isn't kind of unregulated industry to a large extent, or to enough of a large extent, there'd be the risk of people offering AI assisted therapy and leaning very, very heavily on the AI component, and then not actually providing a safe environment for people to do the work. And that could be, that just points again to the need for regulation. But it also leads me on to my next question, which is, do you think there's a place for, given that the integration of AI and psychotherapy seems to be coming, and it could happen in the ways that I've described potentially, is that, do you think it should be a necessary and required part of training that people actually think deeply about how they use it? I certainly would want my therapist to, if they were going to use it, to have thought a lot about it.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Harry. I think you're right. And yeah, you're raising some really important concerns there, actually. And I think it is going to need to be part of training. If people are going to use it, like what you're saying about the biases is absolutely right. That could be embedded in it. Confidentiality issues, as we've been talking about, how you then keep somebody safe within the context of using AI and making sure that there's skill enough to kind of use that. There's also, people are going to be using, and I'm sure already are using AI just independently for therapeutic processes. If you talk to ChatGPT and tell it your problems, it will engage with you. And in my experience of just kind of having to go at those kind of conversations, a lot of it is pretty helpful. It's not, it doesn't come up with stupid answers. It's very empathic and is fairly flexible and it's fairly open. I've yet to had a response from ChatGPT that I think, oh my god, if somebody heard that, that would be a terrible thing. This colleague of mine, Laura, who did a comparison of responses from AI and responses from therapists, as I understand it from her research, that the AI responses, I think, were rated more positively.
Just to come back on that, I think some of the drawbacks of that are, number one, that the frame of the client being held by the therapy, i.e., having a set time every week, having someone turn up for them 50 minutes, that is absent when you can free and willingly use AI, just kind of 5 minutes here, 10 minutes there, half an hour here. So I think there's something lost in the frame of being held in the therapy, number one. The second thing is, it means a lot more when someone says something to you than if you're just reading it off a screen. Yes, the AI might have produced better responses, but would it mean more having the slightly less optimized responses coming from a human being who really meant them?
I think those are, in a sense, are both kind of good empirical questions. And you can certainly research that. there's one question about, for instance, like you say, you might lose that containment of the 60-minute hour that is once a week. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? My sense is that for some people, some of the time, that having that kind of shorter burst and maybe support from AI or AI assisted therapy in some way, that might actually really work for them. I mean, certainly if you look at when we've done research about counselling in schools, that for some kids, this idea of, an hour every week, particularly when everything's going well, just like, why would I want to go see the counsellor when actually everything's fine? So I think that, it's difficult to know really what, these are the kind of research, I guess these are the things that we need to learn about, and we need to be open. And I guess from a pluralistic standpoint, it's maybe trying not to think there's a right and a wrong here, but more that, different clients might need different things, but research can help us understand more about the kind of general trends and which direction it tends to go and what might determine where something like an AI support might be more helpful. I think the one, you're saying about it feels more, for instance, you could do a study and you could look at where you've got, say, a very, very empathic AI and a person who is kind of there but is giving less empathic responses, actually which of those is more helpful. I would guess that with the therapist, my prediction would be that it depends how much they feel that therapist cares about them. So I think that if you have a real person but you don't feel that kind of care or that warmth, I don't think that having a real person there is necessarily going to help. I think it's the care that is the important bit. Would be my prediction, but that's an improvement.
Yeah, I think one of the dangers is that AI will give the illusion of sufficiency. So people who actually need more help will think, well, I am talking to my AI every day. And actually, they don't realize that if they did go into therapy, it could make a massive difference.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a potential risk. But I think it's, I wouldn't want to conflate that with the idea that therefore it's not helpful, or that might certainly be true for some people. But I think for some people that, 5 minutes in ChatGPT might be a really good thing. I mean, these are research questions, Harry, and they're research questions and they're ethical issues. And, what you're saying earlier about having containment and having a professional frame is really important as a starting point. And we have to be really careful about these things. And, I guess what you're picking up is that in some ways AI has kind of run before it can walk, in the sense of people are doing things where we don't know these things, we don't understand them yet. And that is a concern, you're right. But I think we should keep an open mind. And, we just don't know. Like you say, it is going to be there whether we like it or not. So it's a question of how we're going to work with it.
What do you imagine the future of well-being to look like?
I mean, I wrote about this actually. One of the things I did in some of my last book, Psychology at the Heart of Social Change, one of the things I did in that book, which I've never done before, is to do a little fictional bit, because I was writing about how a kind of better society might look like. And I thought, well, I want to put my money where my mouth is and actually try and describe it. So I did a little story about, a kind of better world. The themes in it for me were about real celebration of diversity. So it was about people really getting into their own thing and finding their own way. The story is about kind of an artist or somebody, kind of me, going to visit this future world and spending time with this kind of artist who was very kind of focused on a particular specialism. And I like the idea that in a kind of future world, there are people who'd be using drawing on arts and crafts, and everybody would have an opportunity to be brilliant at something and really evolve and develop, whether that's in kind of arts crafts or whether it's communication or whether that's kind of, in all the different ways, education. So I think that the future well-being ideally would be in terms of differentiation, something about kind of social justice, and where everybody's got access to that and everybody's got the ability to grow and evolve. And, some people have argued that technology can really help that. I know other people like Michael Harvey, who wrote a book called The Age of Few Machines, really is worried about the, impact that technology can have. Something about honesty, authenticity, about people being able to kind of be themselves and relate effectively to others. I think people learning emotional, interpersonal skills where people can communicate what they like and what they don't like, and we don't have all this kind of faffing around with people saying one thing and meaning something else, but being much more direct. And I guess kind of also a world in which people ask and are open to kind of big existential questions about kind of like meaning and death, because these questions aren't going to go away, but at least we can maybe talk about them and have some kind of culture where it's okay to address those as part of this kind of wonderful diversity that we have.
And what do you think it would mean if we did?
If we did have that, I think people would live fuller lives. I wouldn't say they'd be happier, because I think there's probably limits on human happiness, but I think people will live fuller lives. And I think for me, wellness and well-being is about the kind of fullness of life, rather than perhaps just being happy like in the Matrix.